Kennedy Saves the World, and today I will hopefully save you from Antifa. They are a bunch of stinky bastards which have infected the dear city that I call home, Portland, Oregon, which was arguably one of the most beautiful, livable cities in the world until just a couple years ago when it fell into hell-bound handbaskets thanks to extremely liberal and incompetent politicians who are arguably some of the worst in the country, and they are giving people like Andrew Cuomo and Gavin Newsom a run for their money. It's really gotten bad, and it is a place where violent riots occur nightly. Police officers are harmed. Businesses, small and large, are damaged. Things are set on fire. People are killed. They're injured. They're assaulted. And it's interesting because a lot of the local journalists have essentially been beaten into submission, and they have been terrorized by Antifa, which is not just an idea. It's not just a group of stinky unemployables. It's arguably a domestic terror force. And they have ravaged the ideology and the cities and have piggybacked onto BLM protests to create riots and firestorms across the country, as we witnessed last year in the wake of George Floyd's murder. Now, having said that, there is one person who has, his name is inextricably linked with Antifa because he's one of the few people who will report firsthand on their antics and also regularly publishes mugshots that should be made publicly available of the people in Antifa who are hurting cops and hurtling rocks and piss bombs and all sorts of other stuff, creating a form of anarchy that is the opposite of freedom. So I've been very, very eager to talk to this person. His name is Andy Ngo, and maybe you've heard about him because he makes Antifa really, really mad. But he also does a very good job of documenting their exploits, and he is public enemy number one for them. They have attacked him. They almost killed him. They dox him repeatedly. And this is under the cover of local journalists in Portland who are basically helping out Antifa by outing Andy wherever he goes. And Andy Ngo, welcome to Kennedy Saves the World.
Thank you so much for having me on.
I want to read a line from your book. So Andy has a new book out. It's called Unmasked. So if you have been curious how Antifa operates and what they might do in your city, I would give the book a read. It's a very readable book. It's very interesting. It is told in the first person because, and we'll get into this, but one of the lines that really struck me is, you were talking about journalists who spread falsehoods about you and about Antifa, and you wrote on page 220, I'm not only attacked for my criticism of Antifa, I am targeted for doing what those reporters should be doing, reporting the truth. What is the truth about Antifa, Andy Ngo?
The truth about Antifa is that they are not so-called anti-fascists. They're not fighting for racial justice or social justice. They're violent extremists, anarchist communists who are trying to agitate for a revolution in the United States. And at the local level, what they're doing is destabilizing local governments. And they take root and have influence in areas where politicians are afraid of them, essentially. And that's what has happened in Portland and Seattle and some other cities where you have left-wing mayors, city councils, governors, everybody who doesn't want to be seen to be going against the so-called anti-fascist agenda.
And the anti-fascist agenda, which you lay out pretty good, it's militant opposition to free markets, which is a free market libertarian. I fully disagree with that. And also, they want to destroy the United States from the inside out and destroy capitalism, which as a capitalist, I am also opposed to that ideology. And, when I think about their supposed aims, my question is, and replace it with what? Because, here you have a bunch of babies throwing public tantrums for months at a time when they could be doing something productive and optimistic and taking people with them. But they're not. They are wallowing in the feces of their unsound ideas. And then they go home and they eat Taco Bell and they go to Target and they do every other thing that every other American does when they participate in a free market economy. And they are a bunch of hypocrites. Now, when did you start covering Antifa and when did they start to dislike you?
I started covering them back in 2016 when I was a student journalist across the U.S. In some of the urban areas. What was happening in response to then candidate Trump and then President-elect Trump was that it gave the Antifa an opportunity to move from the fringes of the far left into the mainstream left, because now suddenly all of our paper records, all our mainstream Democrats and mainstream liberals were rallying together under this banner of #resist, which is a term from warfare, by the way, believing that Trump's electoral win was a sign of ascendant fascism in America, and we needed to resist by any means necessary, including challenging the results of the election, disrupting lives, in the case of Portland and some other cities being violent. So what I saw in November 2016, just as a student journalist with a phone out covering the protests, is there were hordes of marauding thugs dressed in black and carrying melee weapons, breaking up buildings, starting fires in the streets. You know, when you're seeing images like that, you think of something from like Islamic State or something. I didn't know anything about Antifa at that time. Unfortunately, for the next 4 years, that type of militant far left violence became routine, banal, to the point that it was uninteresting to the local journalists. They wouldn't even really cover it. And then it escalated into the 120 days of nightly violence that we saw last year.
Yes, and it was nonstop. And so what was interesting about that is you could tell that they had no empathy for the core message in the Black Lives Matter movement, because the aim of that movement was purported to be criminal justice reform, which I am also a proponent of. I think we need criminal justice reform in this country in many, many ways, and we were starting to have a good conversation about it, oddly enough, under a Republican president. But the First Step Act was much more than any Democrat president had done, certainly in my lifetime. In fact, the current president has done more to create racial inequality and mass incarceration in communities of color. Joe Biden, with his various crime bills, specifically the 1994 crime bill, than any Republican had. So I thought that we were on a good path. And then you had a series of high-profile deaths, really culminating in the death of George Floyd. And then what you saw was, protests, which started out as peaceful with a list of somewhat reasonable demands that devolved into riots. So what role did Antifa play in co-opting Black Lives Matter riots, or protests rather, and turning them into Antifa riots?
So in Portland and Minneapolis, what I was seeing either on video or with my own eyes is that very small groups of people dressed head to toe in black as part of the Black Bloc, they would take the initiatives that would turn a heated, angry protest into riots and looting. And all they had to do was to begin breaking the windows of businesses and breaching the security of a building. And then from there, just unleashing and letting people who are opportunists and other thugs and criminals to go in and loot those buildings clean. And then the anarchists would come in and start a fire and in some cases burn down the entire place. I think regarding BLM, there's kind of two BLMs in that there's like an unofficial in terms of the movement, lowercase BLM, of what people think when they take to the streets to call for criminal justice reform and other changes in criminal justice system. There's also the formalized BLM, which has its ideology more clearly laid out by its three co-founders. And if you read their writings, and look at what they actually call for, it's very extreme and radical. It's revolutionary communist politics. It's stuff that we've seen from similar groups like the Black Liberation Army decades ago. So I think what makes BLM and capital BLM, I should say, and various far left Antifa groups so palatable to many is that they organize the activities ostensibly under these things that sound really benign and noble and just. And it's also a weakness that they recognize that left-wing mayors or city councils, they won't dare to go against because they'll be seen to be going against, the cause of Black lives or the cause of anti-racism.
This is Kennedy Saves the World. Don't go anywhere.
Jason in the House, the Jason Chaffetz podcast. Dive deeper than the headlines and the party lines as I take on American life, politics, and entertainment. Subscribe now on foxnewspodcast.com or wherever you download podcasts.
The district attorney in Portland has done more damage than the nutless wonder Ted Wheeler, who is the mayor. And it's interesting because Ted Wheeler tried to curry favor with both groups during the summer riots as his city was burning and his cops were being pelted with fluids. And he turned his back on the police and said, if you stand against them, you stand against me because I stand with them. And then, of course, the people in BLM and Antifa started booing Ted Wheeler because he's an absolute incompetent a-hole. It's shocking that someone that bad became mayor of Portland. But then, you found out that he was actually running against a card-carrying member of Antifa in the 2020 fall election. And it's a shocking thing. But that's where Portland is. And it is because of the placating, appeasing, nutless mayor, the city council, and Mike Schmidt, the DA. And they should all be ashamed of themselves because they have taken a phenomenal, beautiful, interesting, creative, artistic city and they have turned it into a hellscape in just a couple of short years. It's actually tough to do, but it makes you wonder what else is going to happen in other cities like that. What do you see?
Yeah, so people who have been supportive of what Antifa are doing, they keep saying, oh, the majority of what's being done is just window breaking, small property damage. But we can actually point quantitatively to the impact to human life ever since these riots broke out.
There were 2 homicides in the CHOP in Seattle last summer. That's right. You lay this out. There were a number of rapes and assaults. And, that was a cop-free zone, and it certainly isn't free when you pay with your life.
That's right. And Portland is experiencing some of its highest homicide and shooting levels on record, to the point now that the FBI has moved in starting last weekend to come and help the Portland police because Portland police are completely overwhelmed. They don't have the resources. By resources, I mean officers to actually respond to shootings.
No, they're trying to borrow officers from, Clackamas County and Multnomah County from the sheriffs and from neighboring cities and towns. And, the chiefs of police there are saying, absolutely not. I'm not going to put my officers in harm's way because you guys are having your city bulldozed by a bunch of idiots. Another thing that you and I have in common is our parents fled communist regimes in search of a better life. And they arrived here on boats. My mom left Romania. The communists took my family's property. My grandmother's family, they were hemp farmers for generations. And I just instinctively hate communists because I saw what they did to Eastern Europe. And I saw the pain that it caused my mom and my uncles and my grandparents growing up because, there were people who were stuck over there and they would try and send them money and they would try and send them, things. And it was never quite enough because they were so just completely oppressed until the 80s and, the late 80s under the fall of communism. And, Romania is one of the places that never really rebounded from that. And, like Oregon, it's supposed to be very beautiful. But so I've always had this sort of natural disdain for communism and Marxism. I think it's bad. I am resentful that it is shellacked and sold as propaganda in most colleges and universities. I think critical thinking and reasoning has absolutely been annihilated in pursuit of this propaganda. But you have a similar story, but your parents had a much, much harder time when Saigon fell in 1975. And your parents were sent essentially to these re-education / concentration camps in Vietnam, and they were able to escape the country and nearly died on a boat when they were, finally given shelter in a refugee camp in Indonesia. And then, they came to the United States. So is there a part of their story that is so implicit in you that you have a natural aversion to violent Marxism?
I think so. I think in the beginning, when I started covering the Antifa beat, I really tried to remove myself from the story, as I was taught as a journalist. But what I was seeing is that, we're not just having, in academia and in public spaces, we're not just having a theoretical discussion about communism versus capitalism. Now, we've seen a wholesale whitewashing of the atrocities committed by communist regimes and individuals from the last century.
Responsible for 100 million deaths. 100 million. Do not forget that number. Maybe up to 150 million. Sorry, continue.
Yes, and that was done. That was justified because of so-called equity, and they put these totalitarian regimes put their own populations into camps and forced them to labor and stole their properties. And today, people don't shiver when they talk about communism in the same way that they talk about Nazism or fascism in the last century. And there needs to be a reckoning and waking up about that. These are issues that are deep within academia. They manifest in things like cancel culture and social justice, identitarianism, all the way into the violent manifestations, which is what I cover, which is left-wing political violence on the streets of America, who say that, who reject the concept of freedom of expression. That's why they take up arms in harming other citizens, is they say that you cannot hold whatever beliefs that we agree with, and if you do, we are going to beat you and rob you and assault you. And if we had any serious leaders, that wouldn't allow it to be going on. But in Portland, it is, if you hold an American flag in downtown Portland, you will get assaulted.
Yes, and if you have a business, it is closed. It is boarded up in large swaths of the city that have been burned and taken over by violent Marxists. And they are horrible people. They are awful people. And, they claim that they want to destabilize this country. And my question will always be, and replace it with what? They do not have an answer. And you point this out in your book. They say they want a society that is borderless. But what was the first thing they did in Seattle? They broke into the Seattle Police Department station and took a bunch of concrete barriers and erected barriers around their occupied zone that no one could penetrate unless they were deemed acceptable and right thinking.
That's right. In the areas where they've created their so-called anarchist autonomous zones, the first thing they do is create a hard border. That's the irony. And also the thing, something that I witnessed this past weekend is seeing how Antifa are joining in on these Palestinian nationalist protests. That's another hypocrisy. So, the ideology it's not consistent. It leads to violence and anarchy and chaos. And you can look at areas where they've claimed territory to see what it leads to. You don't have to take my word for it.
No, and they're pretty bold when they communicate with each other and when they educate future Antifa prospects. So how do you see this story ending, Andy?
So, well, what really needs to happen is that prosecutors have to have the backbone to actually prosecute political left-wing monocultures like Portland and Seattle. I'm not sure if the population has seen enough misery in order to bring in a future prosecutor who will actually clamp down on criminal actions. So I think it has to get even worse before people wake up. As of right now, in Portland, you're seeing the tolerance for the property destruction has plummeted, but the damage has already been done, and I'm not sure if Portland can really recover. I mean, its reputation as it's known now is not as a hipster city filled with great restaurants. It's known as a city that is filled with homeless encampments and riots and violence on the streets, which is accurate.
Yeah, and it's absolutely antithetical to what the city is supposed to be. It is the opposite of livability. Will you keep covering this beat?
I will, but as you mentioned in the beginning, I was beaten and assaulted in the past for my coverage, so I'm constantly having to change up my tactics and think of how I can be undercover in a way that I don't get exposed, because it's not just Antifa that are after me. Even some of the local journalists have written about where they think I am and outed me in some ways. So I just have to be one step ahead, because as important as any individual story is, it's not worth my life.
It's not worth your life. And I'm curious why you think some of the journalists who were supposed to be objective, why they have flushed their objectivity down the toilet. And there are many instances in your book, Unmasked, where they have done that. But why have they done that to you?
So liberal bias has been prominent in media and journalism for decades. But it seems like after Trump was elected, any facade of objectivity or professionalism was kind of thrown out the window in really elite publications. Then at local publications, they leaned full into becoming activists. And it was just welcomed and celebrated as part of the hashtag resistance. And one other thing, though, is I've also observed journalists being harassed and even assaulted for daring to record some of the actions. So for many of them, in order to keep good favor with the Antifa, they would do what the Antifa say, which is to not take pictures or to record in their presence. And that denies the public from getting a full picture about what happens. I refuse to do that. There's a lot of brave independent journalists who refuse to do that. The Intercept recently did a story that went after what they called the Riot Squad, which was a label they fixed to so-called conservative journalists who go out and document these violent protests. So, you get attacked from your so-called colleagues for just going out with a camera. This is not even just providing commentary, it's recording video and putting that out for the public.
Well, keep doing what you're doing. People can read your story. They can read all about Antifa, their origins, the manifestation, and how they have targeted you and how they will essentially stop at nothing. Keep fighting the commies. Andy Ngo, thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been Kennedy Saves the World. I'm Kennedy. For more podcasts from my friends at Fox, you can go to foxnewspodcast.com. You can subscribe to this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Oh, go ahead and leave me a review while you're there. I'd love to hear what you have to say. You've been listening to Kennedy Saves the World on the Fox News Podcast Network.